Welcome to Straight Up with Marc Patrone. Appreciate you tuning in, my friends. I am your host. Well, a former Canadian Olympic snowboarder turned alleged drug trafficking kingpin is now suspected of ordering the murder of a key witness in the case against him. According to the U.S. Department of Justice, Ryan James Wedding controls one of the most prolific and violent drug trafficking organizations anywhere.
Today, we're unsealing a new indictment, charging Wedding with 2 additional counts of witness tampering and intimidation, murder, money laundering, and drug trafficking. The new indictment also includes several other individuals involved in the murder of the witness and other crimes in connection with this criminal enterprise.
Do not get to be a drug kingpin and evade the law. Make no mistake about it. Ryan Wedding is a modern-day iteration of Pablo Escobar. He's a modern-day iteration of El Chapo Guzman. This Justice Department and this FBI will work with our Canadian counterparts and the government officials across the world to bring him to justice.
Yeah, you heard Kash Patel and U.S. Attorney General Pam Bondi calling him basically the largest distributor of cocaine in Canada. Independent journalist Sam Cooper is working on that story. He'll be joining us a little later on as our guest today. An inspector with the Ontario Provincial Police says at least 7 transnational criminal gangs are operating in Canada. Pat Morris says these groups have been designated as terror organizations for good reason.
Intelligence indicates that at least 7 major transnational criminal organizations maintain operations in our country. They have systematically embedded operatives within Canadian shipping logistics chains and export facilities. They have cultivated relationships with corrupted public and private sector employees, including port workers, warehouse supervisors, transportation and licensing officials. They understand Canadian supply chain vulnerabilities, and they exploit them methodically.
Yeah, these criminal gangs are involved in drug trafficking, especially fentanyl, human trafficking, and illegal firearms. Well, is this the deal Albertans and many other Canadians have been waiting for? The Globe and Mail is quoting unnamed sources saying Ottawa, Alberta, close to a deal that includes oil pipeline to BC coast. Sources say the proposed oil pipeline would run from Alberta to the northwest coast of British Columbia. And according to the Globe, the deal would involve granting an exemption to certain ships from the current ban on oil tankers off the BC coast. No word on the possible objections to the oil pipeline in Carney's own caucus. He's got some climate hardliners there, like Stephen Guilbeault and Nate Erskine Smith. Another sign governments are backing away from net zero commitments. BC has scrapped a mandate that every new vehicle sold in the province must be zero emission by 2035. It's also canceled a rebate program for EVs. Energy Minister Adrian Dix says the 100% sales goal and a 90% target for 2030 are just no longer realistic. Highly skilled immigrants are the most likely to leave Canada, according to the Institute for Canadian Citizenship. The CEO of that organization, Daniel Bernhard, says most of the skilled workers leaving are, well, most likely to do so in the first 5 years of their time in Canada.
The 5-year departure rate for immigrant healthcare workers is 36%. That's the same for scientists. The 5-year departure rate for experienced executives is 193% above average. Software developers, AI and cybersecurity professionals, managers in finance, engineering, architecture, the very people who can help Canada build the economy and infrastructure and housing of the future all leave at above average rates.
Yeah, and more than a third of immigrant healthcare workers head for the exits within 5 years of getting here as well. And I'm now joined by the founder of the Bureau and independent journalist, Sam Cooper. Welcome, Sam.
Great to be with you.
Well, we now hear from the likes of Kash Patel and Pam Bondi that this former Canadian Olympic snowboarder turned alleged drug trafficking kingpin sounds like one of the most notorious Canadian crime figures in history. Maybe you could give us a little bit of background on this.
Yeah, for sure. The Ryan Wedding story should be deeply shameful to all Canadians, and it should underline that there has been some truth to what President Trump and Kash Patel have accused, that Canada is being used by Mexican cartels and Chinese Communist Party fentanyl precursor suppliers. And I've done a lot of reporting, a lot of it sourced from American government people that were very frustrated that Canada and the RCMP were not adequately investigating wetting. And that's really the core of the story. This former snowboarder raised up the ranks of BC organized crime, starting in cannabis. He made connections with very, I will call them state adjacent Iranian money launderers. He made connections to women with good access to Mexican cartels. And in a nutshell, he became the possibly the single conduit of Canadian organized crime, which is just exploding in terms of the number of crime gangs on the streets in Canada. He became their conduit to the Mexican cartels. He controls that pipeline. And so I've been told by my American government sources that not only the Drug Enforcement Administration, of course, the FBI, the ATF have been looking at wetting very seriously. And one of their top concerns is his lethality, his brutality. I was told that he was killing Canadians right and left over the past year, and RCMP, Canadian police, weren't doing much to cooperate with the Americans, which obviously have a lot more information about wetting. So how is he using Canada? He is essentially, as I've reported, using Indo-Canadian trucking networks to go down into the United States, bring industrial loads of cocaine and methamphetamine up across our borders. They use Canada's ports to send that out to Australia, New Zealand, I believe Europe, where they can make a lot of money for the cartels and the Chinese networks. And they are, as you've probably heard, running super labs in Canada also. These will be connected to wetting, where they're taking those Chinese toxins, the precursors for fentanyl, ecstasy, methamphetamine, producing them in these Canadian labs, some of them, by the way, on First Nations land, and then shipping that product around the world, including down into the United States. That is true.
Well, obviously, Wedding has not been convicted of murdering anybody. He's going to have his day in court eventually, and he'll try to prove his innocence. But do you think that this is going to be a wake-up call, that it'll shake Canadians as far as these super labs? I understand that one was recently shut down, and that it'll maybe lead to closer ties with the Americans, whom, according to your sources, say that, Canada really has not been a terrific partner in terms of cooperating with the American authorities. Will something like this maybe change things, do you think?
Yeah, I'll answer in two parts. The first is that my reporting over the past year, I'm not trying to be a bad Canadian. I've been going to US sources, including Derek Maltz, the former leader of the DEA, and he said openly and on the record that the RCMP caused a major concern by not cooperating with the US government on a super lab in Falkland, British Columbia, that I assert is connected to Ryan Wedding and others. The network in Canada involving Wedding, Chinese crime, Iranian crime, Canadian bikers is massive. And the RCMP failed to cooperate. This is Derek Maltz on the record. Remember, a senior official telling Donald Trump that Canada is failing. So that's the story of why we're being accused by President Trump of dropping the ball, why we face tariffs, I believe, probably some of them justified. Is it getting better? Look, I'm told that the new fentanyl czar, Kevin Brosseau, does get the problem. That doesn't mean that he's going to come out and say that Canada is shipping fentanyl or Ryan Wedding is shipping fentanyl to the United States. But I'm told behind the scenes, he's having conversations with senior officials in the United States, and they believe he gets it. They believe they're starting to see let's call it the groundwork for better cooperation. But here's the big caveat. My American sources, and I believe them, say there's still a problem at the political level in Ottawa, where some people in Mark Carney's government still do not want to admit that Canada has a big problem. But when we look at Ryan Wedding, you're right, he hasn't been convicted, but I have no doubt that he's responsible for many deaths, from drug overdoses to murders to innocent victims, like a family in Caledon that were mistaken for Indo-Canadian drug shippers and got executed. I believe he is behind a lot of that.
We've had, I think, between 50 and 60,000 people dying of opiate overdoses in Canada. when Mark Carney, the prime minister, was asked about it a while back, he said, well, it's not a crisis. Is that the kind of thing you're talking about? A combination of, just an unwillingness to accept that we're in a very serious position here, and that combined with a level of foot dragging, which is very troubling and disturbing. What do you think?
Yeah, that is what I'm talking about. And I'm sure you and other astute media veterans and watchers noticed that, after the Mark Carney government essentially said that Donald Trump and Kash Patel were making fake allegations that Canada didn't play a big role in the Western Hemisphere fentanyl trade, we saw reports from the Globe and Mail saying it's only a minimal amount, a so-called investigation that sounded very much like PMO talking points. Same from the CBC. And, I say the evidence has just mounted up in the months that have passed. 2 weeks ago, we learned that in May, a massive shipment, I believe 4,000 kilograms of containers from China for fentanyl, I believe it's GHB, all kinds of these, toxic drugs were coming into Vancouver. So that starts to color in, what I say Americans, that is Washington, had the intelligence, but due to some level of respect for Canada as a jurisdiction, they're not coming out with all the evidence and information. They have to leave it to Ottawa to own up to these seizures and super labs. And so you see the information slowly leak out. So this is what I'm talking about in Ottawa. I call it a culture of denialism. I testified in Ottawa that Canada has major legal problems where many of the cases involving Wedding have simply fallen apart before they get up to trial. So you mentioned he's not convicted. Yeah, and he probably won't be in Canada because we lack the laws, and that's a big problem.
Yeah, I mean, there's just no excuse for it. It doesn't make any sense. And of course, there's also the suspicions that people's palms are being greased by the Chinese, possibly by the Mexicans. So we're talking about people handling the container traffic. At that point, I think we only check 1 out of 100. I believe you probably know that number better than I.
That's a true figure. In Vancouver ports, less than 1% coming in is searched, and even less of what is going out is searched. It's a major problem.
Yeah, I mean, no wonder they think that they can use Canada as a base of operations. It's just too easy for them to bring in these precursors. I mean, Peter Navarro, of course, advisor to Trump, was talking about Canada being taken over by the Mexican cartels. Now, you can say, well, he's using overheated rhetoric here. But when you start looking at these super labs, the number of them here, and then you start looking at the lack of action on the part of our federal government and police authorities when it comes to cooperating with the feds, you really have to wonder what's going on and whether the tentacles reach so deep that bribery and corruption at the highest levels is a problem. Do you think that's a possibility?
Look, I do. It's not with any eagerness that I answer questions like this by saying that my American sources do point to the political level and say, yes, Canada is now busting some super labs under pressure, but are they going after the senior level Chinese operators who I assert are very politically involved in Canada? No, they're not. And to your point, we had an OPP senior officer go on. You may have seen the clip. He said there are 7 transnational gangs operative in Canada. So I believe some of them would be the Mexican cartels he's pointing towards and the Chinese networks. And he said they are involved in government corruption. It doesn't get any more point blank than that. So from CBSA officers to people working in ports to police officers, I have no doubt that there is some corruption involved, maybe even wide scale. And at the political level, it could be a question of, as I testified recently, the RCMP lacks the capacity to pursue sensitive cases. We even heard in the Hogue Commission into Foreign Interference, the RCMP acknowledged they got information on a Chinese state-connected money laundering operation that was believed to connect to influence, and the RCMP didn't investigate it. Their answer was, well, there are so many networks that it probably wouldn't have made a difference. So if that seems like there's a smell, there's a toxic smell coming off that type of information, in my view.
Yeah, it's interesting. The Sinaloa cartel was on that list of 7. that you mentioned, and we see how deadly serious Trump is about this administration. Now, of course, we know what's happening in the Caribbean with the attacks on these narco boats. Now we have the president reaching out to the president of Mexico, Scheinbaum, and talking about, would she approve of military strikes in Mexico on some of these cartel operations? No telling how far he'll go. I mean, if he starts thinking that Canada isn't doing enough, I mean, you have to wonder just how far the U.S. administration would go, whether they'd start launching military strikes on our side of the border. I mean, is that unthinkable considering
Well,
discussions you've had with your sources?
I mean, I'm glad you brought it up like that. I've been trying to, in my reporting and in podcasts, tell Canadians that the focus on drugs by the American government is geopolitical. They believe, whether President Trump says it or not, when he's meeting with Xi Jinping, his intelligence says that China is willfully flooding North America with fentanyl and other drugs. They say Maduro of Venezuela operates a gang that you can read the indictments. They're saying Venezuela willfully is attacking the United States with drugs. Even the people that don't agree with Trump, such as his former national security advisor, say regime change in Venezuela is the right move because China, Iran, and Russia are operating from that base. And by the way, my reporting shows that Ryan Wedding was operating through Venezuela. This is an area also where Hezbollah and Iran have military operators. So to your question, yeah, I think if we're reading the tea leaves, when the US government military is hitting boats with missiles, it's about more than drugs. It's about their view that the drugs coming into North America are a type of warlike activity. And you're right. Let's look at what Secretary of State Rubio said about Mexican cartels just last week. He said they have state-like capabilities, including intelligence. So the U.S. government, to your question, they're already pushing at the borders of Latin American nations. Canada could never have been put into that category 10 years ago. But with Mexican cartels clearly operating on borderlands, including First Nations reserves, as I've reported on, I do ask the question whether U.S. Special Forces want to get together with Canadian Special Forces if they had let's call them the authorities to move on cartels. And I've even interviewed a former Canadian Special Forces operator that says, yeah, we could do that. We have the capacity and the will. All we need is the go-ahead from Marc Carney and his senior people in Ottawa.
And I'm wondering if something like that could enter into trade talks once, assuming they ever get back on the rails, whether something like that might come up, especially within the context of everything you've been speaking about.
I'm sure.
Yeah, please.
I'm sure they will. Even Marc Carney himself, if we listen to his sound bites, he would, after going down to Washington or even in the room with Mr. Trump, I think he said, I think we're looking at a deeper integration in economic and security. So absolutely, if we fill in the blanks of what you just asked, I'm sure they're talking about better interoperability between Canadian, at least police forces, because of what I've just said, that a lot of people in the US government have been upset with the RCMP for, as I'm told, dropping the ball on cases like Ryan Wedding.
Well, I want to thank you for your brilliant analysis of that. But I also know that you have some strong views on Prime Minister Carney, and that certainly aligns with the rest of our discussion here, taking us closer to China. And I'm wondering whether the reticence on the part of some senior officials in Ottawa might, on dealing with this issue, might stem from their willingness to kowtow to the communist Chinese. What do you think?
I think that's the case. My work, I did a book in 2021 called Willful Blindness, essentially about how Canada's elites for a long time, decades, have been opening the door to business investment between Canada and China. And it's not like this trade was really benefiting, the whole country. We have a massive deficit in what we send to them versus what they send to us. But I argued in my book that sort of business elites, especially in Quebec, that are very supportive of the liberal leaders, have their own private business dealings with Beijing. This has been going on for a long time. And I talked to Dr. Charles Burton very recently, and he said, with Mark Carney's recent comments about re-engaging with a strategic partnership with Beijing, Dr. Burton said, look, it sounds like Mark Carney is going full Jean Chrétien, 1990s, the Team Canada missions to China, where it was all about increasing trade, and it didn't work out well. Our trade, that deficit that is China flooding us with their goods they want to get rid of, and us not being able to send quality goods back, it's only benefited China. And so I have deep concerns in many ways. One of them is that I feel our last election, Mark Carney benefited from, as we know, it's documented that Chinese propaganda was boosting his chances. And as we hear from, columnists like Brian Lilly have documented that the efforts to get conservatives to cross the floor and give Mark Carney a majority continues. And I just say that's dangerous. If Carney is trying, and he's openly now attempting to get closer to China, perhaps using it as leverage in that trade battle with Washington. But that's not the type of leverage you want to get on an ally that is really, I say, not just reports come out saying Washington and Beijing are circling around and getting closer and closer to war surrounding Taiwan. So my headline here is Beijing as a strategic partner is suicide for Canada.
Thank you so much for this. Willful Blindness is the name of the book. How can people access that book?
You can go on Amazon, and the book launched at #1 in 2021 in Canada, and it's still up there in the top 100. So you can pretty easily get it online.
And you have a Substack page as well.
The Substack is thebureau.news, which I started in 2023. Now over 30,000 non-paying subscribers, enough paying subscribers to pay my bills and keep it going right now.
Sam Cooper, thank you so much for coming on the show. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And that is it for this edition of Straight Up. Appreciate you tuning in, my friends. Let's do it again soon, shall we? Bye-bye for now.